Hey everyone, welcome to the Kentico Rocks podcast. Yes, we are back for 2021 with episode number 36. Very excited today. I think we've got a fantastic topic that is really relevant to today's world. And I'm excited also because I'm here to be joined with one of my good friends again, Andy Thompson from Luminary. Andy, how are you doing?
Good, thanks, Brian. How are you?
Good. Well, thanks for coming on to the podcast. It talks all about Kentico experience, Kentico Kontent.net, and Azure. Today's topic is actually going to be the trends that we're seeing with enterprise clients and organizations with headless. It's something that we have been seeing more and more of. And I don't know about you, Andy, but my organization is seeing quite a bit this year. What's going on there with Luminary in that world of headless and enterprise? Anything that you're seeing down there?
Yeah, definitely. I think the trend started, a year or two ago, but it was very much those early adopters where they had a very vocal, technically forward person in the organization pushing it, a CIO or something who had done their research and was trying to push a microservices or headless thing inside the company. But more and more now, I think marketers, technical business people, they're all aware of and familiar with the concept of headless and microservices. And it's less us pushing it now because we think it's a good thing, and we're actually getting quite a few people coming to us and saying that they've already been researching headless and looking at options, and they actually want to go with a headless approach, which is it's great. It's music to my ears.
Yeah, it's funny. We were prepping for the show, and I think we both said that the trend isn't coming. The trend is here, right? It's upon us. It's
Oh
it's amazing how it's different than maybe last year or years past.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's arrived. I feel like 2020 and 2019 I spent trying to convince people about headless, and now it's great. Now we're actually implementing it and strategizing around it. Doing headless architectures and stuff. It's great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so actually, that's a great way to start because we've got three kind of major topics today, everyone. The first topic we're going to talk about is kind of our insight into maybe why this trend is here, and I'm going to ask Andy maybe how he has been handling that conversation. I'll add a little on my experience as well with that and talking to different marketing directors, different business executives, and even technical people. Our second category we're going to get into then maybe how one of our favorite headless CMS is handling that response and that activity, and actually what Kentico Kontent is doing in the enterprise space. And finally, we're going to kind of dig into just considerations you need to take or have as an agency or a provider or a developer to serve these needs with a headless tool. So, getting back to the first point, Andy, you mentioned last couple of years you were kind of feel like you're in education mode almost of trying to tell people why there's a value behind a headless versus a traditional all-in-one. Maybe what are one or two things that come to mind that you were having as a pattern in those conversations with different people that you could share with our audience?
Yeah, so I guess the conversation was often around firstly educating them on what it is, what headless is, and that idea of decoupling the CMS completely with the presentation. So we would be, using examples like the ability to push to multiple channels from a content hub, and using terms like a content hub. But the other one was educating people on some of the benefits that you can get from going headless around things like security, stability, performance, scalability, all that sort of stuff that you sort of unlock these potential benefits. And that was my prediction at the time, was that those things would make headless CMS really appealing for enterprises, because once a headless CMS can tick all the boxes and do all the things for marketing users and technical users, the business, especially enterprises, really want those things. They want scalability, performance, uptime, SLAs, all of that sort of all of those benefits that you get with headless. So they're probably the two major things I was saying: what it is and what those extra benefits are going to be once you've got it.
Yeah, yeah, and I agree. I think the benefit part of the conversation I think is where we spend more time when we're dealing with conversations that are we're not talking to developers about this API versus that API or this technology versus that. It's more of the why. Like why should we be doing this? And I also
Yeah.
come at it from an angle of like future proofing your investment, right?
Yeah.
These microservices or headless CMSs give you the ability to have your own stack, as we've talked about, I think, in one of our past podcasts, that you can put in something like a Kentico Kontent. You can bring in some other tool from an email marketing standpoint or form standpoint, and have the best of breed. But it's it's uh, it's not something where you're using maybe this big monolithic system that has a large install, that has a server behind it, and it's hard to move out of it to get to the next generation of your site, because every 4, 5, 6 years, if you're a major enterprise, you're probably looking at possibly rebuilding some things. Maybe you're
Yeah.
moving away from SharePoint or even WordPress, other things that have shown their age and aren't going
Mm.
to be supported by Microsoft anymore if you're like, say, SharePoint 2013 or something. And having
Yeah.
Headless CMS, it's something that you can kind of basically use as you need to, and there's an easy way to get your content in or out, because at the end of the day, you're just dealing with an API, and your presentation is already separated away from the actual management of the content. And
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think that's a really good point that the decision is less about comparing those individual features. When people are talking about whether to go headless, they're not comparing this specific headless CMS versus this specific traditional CMS mostly. It's usually these higher level decision makers, your CIOs, your CTOs, your CMOs, who are looking at um, a broader decision. It's not, does this one have the exact feature I'm looking for? It's more, what benefits will the organization get out of this? How can we reuse this platform for other use cases, other channels, other projects down the track? And yeah, like you said, what is the 3, 5, 10-year roadmap look like? Are we going to be able to stay on this platform and grow with this platform, or is this just a website project and we just need, a tool to build a website?
right, right. The other thing I think they need to consider is how can it scale and perform on a global
Mm,
need, right? So you're dealing with enterprise
absolutely.
organizations. It's not just here in the US that we're providing a solution, or down in Australia you're providing a single solution. We're looking at how can we provide a solution that works well in the US, Europe, and Asia, and
Yeah.
make sure it works well. And honestly, if you have a monolithic on-premise installation, there's a super set of challenges that you may not be able to deliver that promise of
Mm.
a fast performing websites or dealer portal, customer portal, e-commerce project if you're not using some of these modern tools. And I think that's another big
Yeah, it can
benefit here.
be. Yeah, it can almost be counterintuitive, by having a really big, powerful traditional platform behind you that can actually be a hindrance if you want to launch in four different markets or something. I spoke to a customer just the other day who that was one of the challenges they're facing. As they went global, they have now ended up with four installations of a major platform. And one of the reasons they're looking at headless is because they want to put it all into one globally distributed hub,
Mm-hmm.
which is a perfect use case.
And I think the other thing is,
Mm.
the thing I'm having a conversation with is a lot of enterprises, they have certain tools already in place. Like, actually, I'm running into a ton
Yeah.
of Binder from a digital asset management system lately. And I don't know if you run into that, Andy, or not a lot, but Binder is very popular here. And, you know, if that is a CDN delivery system for assets, and you can deliver things worldwide, and there's a large investment into it, trying to like walk that back and say, let's implement in a traditional, like, I don't know, WordPress or Umbraco or even Sitecore or Kentico Experience, there's not that same mesh and fit. Whereas if you bring a headless CMS to the table, okay, well, we're dealing with an API from Binder, and we're
Yeah.
dealing with an API from Kentico Kontent or others, and that's
Yeah.
now the
It
same
plays
similar.
nicely.
Yeah, they play nice. It's the same ballpark.
Yeah, that's actually one of the sort of, I guess, almost like a myth busting point that I've used a lot when I'm helping people understand the headless thing. You talk about an all-in-one platform in a traditional CMS. They're never all in one. Someone might have a huge monolithic traditional platform, but they're probably using something like a Salesforce or a Dynamics as well,
Mm-hmm.
or a campaign monitor or a Mailchimp or something like that for their email. They're probably using SendGrid for email delivery. They've probably, if you ask them to actually see their technology landscape across all their MarTech stack, whatever, their CMS is still going to be one piece of a much broader picture. So in the headless CMS, I think plays much more nicely in that environment.
Yep. Yep. So there's kind of some of the conversation points that we have around that. I think we also want to spend a lot more time on just the next two parts of the conversation. So I'm going to kind of segue us on just because you may have heard these conversations about traditional versus headless quite a bit. But we want to add kind of our own insight into one of our favorite headless CMSs, Kentico Kontent, and how it serves this enterprise need pretty well. And there's a couple features involved, but maybe, Andy, what one comes to the first of your mind in terms of something that Headless CMS needs to handle for an enterprise workload?
Yeah, so I guess obviously there are features that enterprise people will do and do love, but that everyone loves. There's a bunch of great features in the CMS, but there's some that always come up. Like you mentioned before, they're less about actually what it can do and just more about that sort of enterprise needs this, like the stability and security. So a couple of features that come to mind are, there's around workflow and permissions and stuff. But one they launched recently was a detailed full audit log of everything that has been changed in the system by users. It might sound like a minor feature, but I find that's one of the differences. Say you're doing there's an RFP or a tender or something for a big government site or something like that. They have a lot of these features that take a lot of implementation in the CMS, and things like snapshots of what something looked like at a given point in time. Now, this audit log is a really important one because if something has changed or something was removed from a website or something like that, they need the ability to drill down and see exactly what happened when, who did it, what was the previous version, what's the current version, that sort of stuff. So that's one great feature that was added in recently.
Yeah, and if you haven't seen any of the, buzz around that feature with Kentico Kontent, there is a recorded webinar where the product team kind of goes over the details of Audit Log. So I encourage you to check that out. You can find that on the kontent.ai site underneath it's probably like the learn or the blog section. You can get to those, which is nice because you can see they demo all the Audit Log features, and I think they did a good job with that webinar. For me,
Yeah, absolutely.
the one that really comes to mind that other headless CMSs I've compared to don't quite have is actually the feature that Kentico Kontent calls collections. And it's funny, when they first explained this to me, they basically shortly said, well, it's like a group of folders for how you kind of divide and separate out contents for specific business units or regions. And I'm like, okay, well, we already have taxonomy, we have filters, we have all sorts of ways to divide out content. Why would I don't quite get it. So I'll admit it took me a little bit to come around, but actually now that the feature is mostly released and I've got my hands wet with a little bit, and in hearing the conversations I've been having the last 6 months with some enterprises around, well, we actually need a whole set of information, but we need to be controllable in Latin America versus US versus Europe, and being able to separate out the content management aspects of dealing with that content in certain departments, certain groups, certain divisions, but basically still have the ability to change a page type and have it apply to all those things, is really pretty cool. I don't know, Andy, have you had a chance to check out this collections feature at all?
Yeah, I have. And I think I had the same feeling. I was like, when they first described, while they were developing, I thought, oh, great. So it's kind of like tags, is it? But then I later realized that the power behind that is then you're going to be able to apply different permissions. So you might have content that's available to your entire organization, but as reusable content, but the majority of the organization can't edit it, for example, which will simplify the editing process for people. So they can just go through a content library, they can create their own, but this sort of shared collection, and that works for multi-project, sort of multi-organizations. You might be able to have a collection for one business unit in Australia and one in the USA and one in Europe. But then you could have a global collection, which is coming from the global marketing team, which they don't have to worry about the Australians editing or deleting or whatever, but they give them this shared content library and it's all in the same place. There's heaps of different use cases. Obviously, content has the you can have multiple projects and all that sort of stuff, and you can have multiple language versions of things. But this is that extra way to sort of slice and dice and share and control your content, which straight away makes it just so much more powerful for those multi-business unit or global or enterprise customers, I think.
Yeah, and I think that this solves the idea of, wait, do I need to have multiple projects in my headless CMS
Exactly.
for each major region in the world? And the answer to that is, with collections, you don't. And I like to think of it as like basically they added another dimension that is really important from a content management in the actual admin side of content, but it's
Yeah,
also on the API side. So you can
it is.
request
Yeah,
content by a collection ID in the delivery API, and so it's all the angles that they have covered, and it really makes it not just like a multi-tenant CMS. It makes it a little bit multi-dimensional, if you will, and it can set up and support all those business units. So, and actually, shameless plug. Here in the U.S., we're having a content user group on March 25th, and I'm gonna give a session on using collections from an enterprise standpoint. So join me. You can check the link out. I'll put it in the show notes on the blog post for the podcast here. But that's going to be my talk. So I'm really excited about that. It's pretty cool. But I think we got to get to a couple more features that really matter for enterprise. And maybe one, Andy, you could speak to a little bit is this whole idea of something that we've been seeing with Andre on the sort of open source side. I don't want to give it away, but can you talk about that tool a little bit?
yeah. So with these ways to obviously that's another thing, not just projects and collections. I mean, another way to slice up your what you're doing in content is around having different environments. So you can sort of you can have a development or a staging UAT production environments for all of your content and all your content types and everything that allows people to go in there and create um, a lot of functionality, do their content modeling, make changes, stage up a whole bunch of content, all that sort of stuff. But then you might be sitting in a situation where a whole bunch of developers in different business units, whatever, have made changes to your development or staging sort of environments inside content, and you want to safely get them across to production. You could use the audit log and go through, or if you were doing a job, you should have documented all your changes and you could be using source control, things like that. But what the open source guys, the community Devrel guys at Kontent have put together is a really cool environment comparing tool. Now, one of the benefits of it being a headless CMS is you can pull everything out of that CMS um, as through APIs as really nicely structured JSON files. So what this tool can do is it can pull out all of the definitions of all of your content types or your content, everything, pull them into this tool and do a really detailed comparison and show you every single difference between a couple of environments. It reminds me of something you guys did for a different platform, Brian.
It's funny how that works. Yeah, they beat us to it. But
Yeah.
so I'm excited to see it. I haven't seen as much as you have. I've heard and seen a couple screenshots, which gets me excited because I think it will be a useful thing, and it plays around with another sort of concept that I really enjoy with content in the last, I don't know, maybe last year and a half, that is this whole idea of the migration CLI tool and how they really want you to go code first with the content model itself. And actually, I think that's a common feature that a lot of headless CMSs have. So I don't think we need to get into that too much. But I love being able to do things with CLIs and comparison tools, and just knowing that deployments are going right. And it's something that is now accomplishable thanks to
I
the
think
DevRel
look,
team.
what it speaks to as well is that the DevRel team are focused on teams with more complex scenarios now as well. You know, the times years ago, it was more about helping people get up to speed with how to use a headless CMS and, you know, building starter sites and, you know, this is how you use Gatsby, this is how you use Next, this is how you use C# and .NET. Now that's all done. You know, it's fully established. So now the DevRel teams are really focused on advanced scenarios and, you know, large teams of developers and enterprise organizations who might be trying to do more complex stuff with the headless CMS, which is really great.
Yep. And if you're on the marketing side, I know we gotta move on to our third topic, but I want to give a shout out to Web Spotlight. I'm sure you've heard about it by now. If you've or in the content world at all, but Web Spotlight is still an amazing way to give marketing teams a nice preview engine that's real time, that's almost edit in place, and it works really, really well. And I know, Andy, you've actually talked about that recently, right?
Yeah, my turn for a plug. So last week, I spoke at the Australian user group on some of the more complex ways you can configure Web Spotlight. The beauty of Web Spotlight is it gives you sort of the experience of a traditional CMS as an add-on to the Headless CMS. So if you are using the Headless CMS for a web project, you can configure Web Spotlight to show your sort of content tree or your navigation or whatever there. And when you click on a page, it loads it up inside content. And if you've included a JavaScript file and a CSS file on your website, it will actually mark up all the fields that you can edit. You can click on them and edit them in place. It's fantastic because often we see the more technical people in an organization, in a larger organization, it's more the technical people who are pushing Headless CMS because they want to use it for omni-channel scenarios and integration scenarios, and they want all their content nice and clean and reusable. And sometimes the marketers can get left by the wayside with a Headless CMS, but this is a purely marketing focused side, and it really brings up that marketing experience to an A class, an A1 experience in the CMS. So if you haven't seen it, check it out. I've got a couple of blogs about it, and they've got plenty of info on the content side as well. But it's a real differentiator, I think, and it's a real winner for marketers.
Yep. And remember, we talked about in the last Kentico Rocks episode as well. So you can watch actually us demo that feature if you're curious about
Oh
web
yeah,
Spotlight.
that's right.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so there's some amazing features that we just talked about that really kind of support enterprise scenarios and needs of projects. But there's also some considerations that we really want to educate anyone who's listening to the show about. You know, there may be certain expectations that large enterprise has with coming from a traditional world, moving into headless. They're used to an all-in-one solution that does a lot of different things. And headless CMS, as a microservice, really, at the end of the day, does a fantastic job at what it does. But that approach means it also doesn't do everything, right? Because if it did everything, well, it would be back to almost like the old world. So there's a few things that we kind of have seen as a pattern, both Andy and I, as we've had these conversations that come up. And, I think our goal for this segment a little bit is to make sure people are aware that here are some things you need to watch for or think through when you're providing that final solution that any modern project has these days. There's a couple things that come to mind for me, like search and forms. But Andy, what are some things that kind of come to your mind that you've had these conversations with some executives in terms of, wait a minute, what about this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first one that did come up all the time was, well, how do I see what I'm editing? And that was a big gap. And so they've had a go at that with Web Spotlight, but they were very conscious to keep it as a separate add-on because they don't want to, I guess, move away from that spirit of a headless CMS, which is to intentionally not try to do everything and to let you integrate with the best of breed services. So they want to be the best way to just manage the content. So, but the stuff, I guess there's two categories. There's the stuff that comes up in every single project. And then there's the stuff that comes up sometimes for more complex scenarios. So the stuff you mentioned, forms and search, obviously in every project. And I think mostly got that licked. We've got some really good best practice tools and things that we like to do with that. But some of the more unique scenarios we come up against is things like integrating with large sets of tabular data, like the kind of thing that in a traditional CMS you would probably build a custom module to manage this data, because you probably don't want to be putting it in a WYSIWYG editor in a traditional CMS either, right? So something like financial data that you want to be showing, or something like that, if you have a lot of detailed information on products. I remember years ago we built a website about different types of steel used in construction, and just the tabular data for all the specifications for all their products was really complex, but financial data as well. So what we find there is a headless CMS may not be the best way to manage huge sets of tabular data. So just like you would in a traditional CMS, where you're not just going to drop that in a table in a page, typically you need some kind of integration. But the good thing about a headless CMS is all the content's coming from an API. So if you just choose a service that has a good API, your developers will be fine. They'll love it.
Yeah, and there's lots of options, right? We even talked about
Mm.
you want an Azure function that returns the data that you need to.
Yep.
That's a great way to do it. Maybe,
Yeah.
not as great a way, but still a way would be to, embed a JSON file somewhere in the system that you can read on a website. But, our example was that we had to find a dealer locator of products. So we have lots of address information, names, locations,
Yeah.
very tabular. And we didn't want to load thousands of rows of address information into Headless CMS. You wouldn't want to manage that. You'd actually want
Mm.
that to come from your ERP or other
Yeah.
true source of
Exactly.
data because you most likely have that as an enterprise.
Yeah.
So you need to do something special there, and I think tabular data is great. I think that I would also like to slightly go back and just touch on forms because
Yeah.
forms, even though it's a common thing on every project, they still spend a lot of time educating people that forms come with lots of things. They come with notification emails, email templates, even sometimes, workflow behind what happens on the form submission, validation, crazy extra special form controls that do certain things. And when it comes to forms, you do have to figure it out a little bit. And what is your favorite way to solve that, Andy, when it comes to those forms?
I like to, first of all, forms aren't just forms. Like you just said, there can be so much behind them. And it's kind of like content management. Forms or e-commerce, for example, forms is a whole world once you scratch the surface. And there are some really, really good ways to do it. If you just need a simple form where you just need some, like a contact form for your website, there are actually some really elegant ways to do it. For example, if you're using Netlify as your CI DevOps hosting, whatever platform. So if you're on Gatsby or Next or something like that, using Jamstack, they have just a beautiful little forms endpoint. So you can get your front ends to just build a form, submit to it, and then inside Netlify, you can just receive that form submission and do whatever you like with it. Or there's some really nice complete third-party forms. There's FormStack, things like that, where you can just go in and they have really powerful form engines with marketing automation, all that kind of stuff, and then you just basically embed the form in your website. That's sort of, I think that's the mindset you need to get into. Is just because you're using content or any headless CMS doesn't mean that you're stuck with that. I think people are used to that from a traditional CMS that comes with a forms module and an everything module. That they're like, oh, we'd better use that. You don't have to. Use something better.
Yep. Yeah, I've used FormStack multiple times. It's a very powerful platform. I really like it because at the
Mm.
end of the day, if you can just know what form to show on your page and
Yeah.
leverage their technology to do it, you're using best of breed from designing the form, dealing with the data
Yeah.
of the form, the
Yeah.
workflow that can go with it. I mean, workflow is another thing that kind of comes up in these conversations. And I'm
Yeah.
not necessarily talking about like the workflow of creating content. It's the workflow of what happens post form submission. Where does it get
Yeah.
routed to? In large organizations, you may have multiple sales departments, multiple product management departments,
Yeah.
warranty departments, customer service departments, and it's not simply a what one email address does this go. It's routed based off certain choices on the form. It goes to one
Absolutely.
CRM versus another CRM. So you may have multiple integrations based off what the form's going. So those services are usually what I recommend as opposed to kind of rolling your own, which actually is even still possible because it's at the end of the day just another
Yeah.
microservice.
Those complex workflows that you just mentioned, that's another scenario we do run into with enterprise organizations. Any CMS off the shelf will have some level of workflow, that you edit it, you review it, you publish it, and you can have steps where only certain people can move past a certain stage in the workflow. That's what in some CMSs you would call a basic workflow. And of course, content has that stuff. But then they start looking at, well, what if I want to do more advanced workflows? And you don't see that immediately in the UI, but again, in this sort of spirit of microservices and headless CMS, the way a headless CMS approaches that is to give you all the integration options. So if they have webhooks, for example, and you can configure a webhook to fire off anywhere and notify any system of any change to any piece of content. So in a headless CMS, you could configure a webhook so that when a piece of content enters a translation step, it immediately in the background fires off to, Zapier or Logic Apps or translations.com or whatever, and does all this complex stuff. And then you can use any platform you like, your CRM, Salesforce, whatever. And then when it's time to come back into content, they have these really cool content management APIs where you can do almost anything you can do through the UI, you could do through APIs as well. So these sort of complex workflow scenarios are not out of the box, but also there are no limits to what you can do because everything can be done through the APIs in the headless CMS.
And that is a fantastic way to summarize a lot of our conversation. Almost anything
Yeah,
can be done with an enterprise headless CMS like Kentico Kontent.
yeah.
So, all right, you and I have kind of talked quite a bit. We're a little over time, so I think I'm hoping everyone gets the point that the trend is here with enterprise. Kentico Kontent is a great way to solve some of that. We've talked about some of those features. I'll put some of the links again in the blog post about this. And there's some things to watch out for. Some things to consider that you're still providing at the end of the day a full solution to your clients. Hope you found the time useful. Andy, I definitely appreciate you once again joining me in Kentico Rocks. It's great to see your face and hear your voice. Hope things are going well down there in Australia. They're doing
They
okay.
are. Yep.
So, all right, we'll end it here. Thank you all for listening. And this, again, has been episode number 36 of Kentico Rocks.